It was a typical Friday evening in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. The Johnson family was hosting their annual high society cocktail party, a gathering of the rich and the influential. The mansion was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and whispered conversations. Everyone who was someone had been invited: business owners, politicians, even a few local celebrities. It was a party people would talk about for weeks. Sophia, a young black woman, lived just a few blocks away. She wasn't part of the usual high society crowd. She had only moved into the area a few months ago, preferring to keep to herself. What her neighbors didn't know, however, was that Sophia wasn't just anyone. She was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world, a company that had recently made international headlines for its groundbreaking innovations in artificial intelligence. Her name was frequently in business magazines and on tech blogs, but few in this neighborhood recognized her. To them, she was just another stranger. The party had been the talk of the town for weeks, and while the invitation list was long, it wasn't inclusive. The Johnsons had made sure to invite all the right people, the ones who belonged. No one thought to invite Sophia. After all, she was black, and despite their smiles and surface politeness, most of the guests held prejudices they didn't even bother to hide. Sophia heard about the party through a mutual acquaintance. "You're not going, right?" her neighbor had casually mentioned. "I mean, I don't think they would, well, invite you." It stung. She had spent her entire life fighting against those unspoken rules, those invisible barriers that tried to keep people like her on the outside. She had learned to rise above the quiet judgments, but it never got easier. That night, though, Sophia decided she wasn't going to stay on the sidelines. She wasn't going to be just another invisible figure ignored by those who felt superior. She was going to the party, whether they liked it or not. Dressed in a sleek, understated black gown, she walked confidently toward the mansion. Her posture was regal, her expression calm, though her heart raced with anticipation. Would they turn her away at the door? Would the whispers start the moment she walked in? She had dealt with worse before, and she was ready for it. When she arrived, the doorman hesitated for just a second, his eyes flickering with confusion. He clearly wasn't expecting her, but her poise and confidence were undeniable. He stepped aside and let her in without a word. Inside, the room was exactly what Sophia had imagined, filled with people who looked nothing like her. The chatter was loud, but the moment she walked in, a heavy silence fell. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and curious, slightly offended eyes turned to her. Whispers followed. Who is she? Is she one of the staff? Did she just walk in? Sophia didn't falter. She grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing server and scanned the room. The Johnsons, the hosts of the evening, stood near the fireplace, laughing with a group of well-dressed guests. Mrs. Johnson caught sight of her, her perfectly painted smile freezing in place. "Excuse me," Mrs. Johnson said, leaving her circle and making her way toward Sophia. Her tone was dripping with a forced politeness, the kind reserved for people who weren't supposed to be there but had somehow slipped in unnoticed. "I'm sorry," she began, looking Sophia up and down. "I don't believe we've met." Sophia smiled softly, her eyes locked on Mrs. Johnson's. "No, we haven't," she replied, her voice calm, unbothered by the obvious condescension in the woman's tone. "I wasn't invited, but I thought I'd stop by anyway." The surrounding guests shifted uncomfortably. Some were clearly offended, while others were just confused. Mrs. Johnson narrowed her eyes, her smile never reaching them. "I see. Well, this is a private event, and the guest list is selective." Sophia took a sip of her champagne. "I'm aware." Mrs. Johnson opened her mouth to say something more, but before she could, a man's voice interrupted. "Sophia?" The voice was surprised, almost breathless. It came from across the room, where a tall, older man stood with his glass halfway to his lips. His face broke into a wide grin as he pushed through the crowd toward her. It was Marcus Wainwright, the billionaire investor known for his no-nonsense business style. He was also one of the most respected and feared men in the industry, and everyone knew him. He reached out to shake Sophia's hand, his grip firm and respectful. "I had no idea you'd be here. I didn't see your name on the list," he said, turning to the crowd as if to highlight the fact. Sophia smiled graciously. "I wasn't invited." The room fell into an even deeper silence. Mrs. Johnson's face turned pale as the realization hit her. She had just humiliated one of the most powerful women in the world. "You didn't invite her?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp, turning to Mrs. Johnson. "Do you know who this is?" Mrs. Johnson stammered, her face red with embarrassment. I didn't know." "This," Marcus said, gesturing toward Sophia with admiration, "is Sophia Evans, Chief Executive Officer of X-Tech Innovations. She's revolutionizing the tech industry right now. Honestly, if anyone deserves to be here, it's her." The shockwaves rippled through the crowd. People who had been looking at Sophia with disdain were now clamoring to get closer, their smiles suddenly warm, their attitudes transformed. They offered congratulations, compliments, and questions about her company as if they hadn't been judging her just moments before. Sophia stood her ground, her expression never wavering. She had seen this happen too many times. The same people who looked down on her would suddenly change their tune when they realized her worth. It was exhausting, and it never felt like a victory. She didn't want their approval. What she wanted was for people to stop seeing her race before they saw her humanity. As the party guests swarmed around her, Mrs. Johnson stood frozen, humiliated and speechless, watching as the black woman she had dismissed became the star of the evening. Sophia politely entertained the sudden flood of attention, answering a few questions with brief, thoughtful responses, though she could feel the insincerity in every compliment, every hand reaching out to shake hers. The same people who had stared at her with thinly veiled disdain were now fawning over her accomplishments, desperate to associate themselves with her newfound significance. But Sophia wasn't fooled. She had been in these situations before, and she knew exactly how this game was played. Marcus Wainwright, sensing the awkward tension that still hung in the air, leaned closer to her. "You know," he said quietly, "you don't have to stay. These people don't deserve your time." Sophia glanced around the room, her eyes briefly meeting Mrs. Johnson's. The woman's once proud posture had crumbled, her face flushed with shame. Sophia could see that for once, the lesson had landed. This wasn't just about her wealth or status, it was about her humanity, something that Mrs. Johnson and the others had so easily dismissed. "Actually," Sophia said, raising her voice just enough for the surrounding guests to hear, "I think you're right." She smiled graciously at Marcus, then turned toward the Johnsons. "Thank you for the warm reception, but I have other commitments tonight." She handed her half-full glass of champagne to a nearby server and made her way toward the door, her head held high. The room watched in stunned silence as she left, unsure how to react. The cold night air greeted her as she stepped outside, and for a moment, Sophia paused at the end of the grand driveway. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Tonight had been a victory of sorts, but it was hollow. She hadn't come to prove anything to anyone. She had simply wanted to belong. Yet the truth was undeniable. No matter how successful she became, there would always be people who couldn't see past her skin. As she walked back to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her assistant, reminding her of an upcoming conference in the morning. Sophia smiled. There was still so much more to do, and there were people in the world who valued her for who she was, not for the color of her skin or the weight of her bank account. She slid into the driver's seat and looked back at the mansion one last time before driving away. The Johnsons and their guests would remember this night, not because of the party, but because of the uncomfortable truth it had revealed to them. And that, for Sophia, was enough. With the city lights fading behind her, she pressed the accelerator, her mind already focused on the future. There was still a long way to go, but Sophia had learned long ago that change didn't happen overnight. It came one uncomfortable moment at a time. As she disappeared into the night, she knew her true victory lay not in their recognition, but in her unshakable sense of self.